The cruelest thing a man can do is pretend the woman holding his life together means nothing. The rooftop ballroom of the Whitmore Regency shimmered above Manhattan like a floating galaxy of crystal and gold, the giant glass walls reflecting thousands of city lights beneath the dark November sky, while the sound of champagne glasses and polished laughter drifted through the crowded charity gala. Every camera in the room seemed drawn toward Adrian Whitmore. At 38, the billionaire founder of Whitmore Dynamics wore power like a second skin. His charcoal tuxedo fit perfectly against his tall frame, his sharp jaw unreadable beneath the soft amber lighting, and every investor, politician, and socialite hanging near him watched carefully for even the smallest reaction from the man worth nearly $4 billion. But Adrian barely noticed any of them. His attention stayed fixed on the woman quietly standing 3 feet behind him near the presentation screen, tablet in hand, headset tucked behind one ear, already solving problems before anyone else realized they existed. Claire Bennett moved through the gala with calm precision, adjusting schedules, greeting donors, rerouting staff, even remembering which executive had a shellfish allergy before dinner was served. She never asked for credit. She never interrupted. And somehow, after 4 years beside Adrian, she had become the invisible rhythm that kept his world from collapsing. "Mr. Whitmore," one reporter said with a grin as cameras flashed nearby, "people online are convinced your assistant practically runs your life." Several guests laughed softly. Adrian took a slow sip of bourbon without looking back at Claire. "People confuse loyalty with importance," he replied smoothly. More laughter followed. Claire lowered her eyes to her tablet screen. The reporter smirked. "So Claire Bennett isn't the secret woman behind the empire?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "Claire Bennett is replaceable." The sentence landed softly, calmly, almost casually. But for Claire, it felt like the air disappeared from the rooftop. Around her, conversations continued. Waiters passed with silver trays. Music floated beneath the glass ceiling. Yet all she could hear was the dull ringing in her ears as she stared down at the schedule she could no longer read properly. Replaceable. 4 years of 14-hour workdays. 4 years of cancelled vacations, midnight panic calls, emergency flights, migraine medication hidden inside her purse because Adrian always forgot to refill prescriptions himself. 4 years of quietly learning the difference between his angry silence and his exhausted silence. And somehow, replaceable. Claire swallowed hard and stepped away before anyone noticed the sudden shine in her eyes. She moved quickly through the ballroom doors and out onto the colder side balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue, wrapping her arms around herself as freezing wind pushed strands of blonde hair across her face. Below, Manhattan traffic glowed red and white like rivers of light stretching endlessly through the city. She tried to breathe normally. Tried to convince herself she was being dramatic. But the truth hurt because some part of her had believed she mattered to him beyond contracts and calendars. "Hey!" Claire turned quickly. Lucas Hale stood in the doorway holding his coat over one arm, concern softening his features. The company's new legal advisor had arrived only 2 weeks earlier, but unlike most executives around Adrian, Lucas actually looked people in the eyes when they spoke. "You okay?" he asked gently. Claire forced a small smile. "Yeah. Just needed air." Lucas studied her face for a second too long before quietly draping his coat over her shoulders anyway. "You don't have to pretend with me." At that exact moment, inside the ballroom, Adrian turned toward the balcony while answering another investor's question. And then he saw it. Lucas standing close to Claire. Lucas touching her shoulder. Claire looking up at another man with vulnerable eyes Adrian had somehow never noticed before. Something sharp twisted violently inside his chest. Not annoyance. Not irritation. Something far uglier. Jealousy. Claire Bennett had learned a long time ago that the people who held the most power were usually the people who noticed the least. By 7 the next morning, Manhattan was buried beneath freezing rain, the sidewalks shining silver beneath headlights while exhausted commuters rushed through steaming streets with coffee cups clutched in numb hands. Inside Whitmore Dynamics headquarters, The top executive floor remained perfectly silent except for the distant hum of computers and the soft ticking of the enormous black clock mounted near Adrian Whitmore's office. Claire stepped out of the elevator carrying 2 coffees and a paper bag from the same cafe she visited every morning at exactly 6:15. 1 black coffee. 1 plain oatmeal with blueberries because Adrian skipped breakfast whenever earnings season approached. She knew his habits the way some people memorized prayers. The receptionist smiled softly when Claire walked by. "You are here early again." Claire forced a polite smile. "Mr. Whitmore has investor calls starting at 8. She entered Adrian's office quietly, already moving on instinct. Tablet beside the laptop. Financial folders aligned perfectly. Migraine medication placed beside his water glass. Then finally, the small pale yellow sticky note she always left near his keyboard. "Tried to eat lunch today." Claire stared at the note for a second before setting it down carefully. 4 years of tiny routines. 4 years of noticing everything about a man who barely realized she existed outside his schedule. The truth was almost embarrassing now. Adrian never remembered to sleep before midnight. He hated thunderstorms because they triggered headaches. He loosened his cufflinks whenever anxiety spiked during negotiations. He always stood near exits in crowded rooms. And whenever stress became unbearable, he tapped his thumb exactly 3 times against the edge of his desk. Claire knew all of it. But Adrian knew almost nothing about her. He did not know she spent every Thursday night helping her mother through physical therapy in a tiny Queens apartment. He did not know she had not taken a vacation in 3 years because medical bills consumed most of her paycheck. He did not know she secretly painted watercolors at 2 in the morning whenever life felt too heavy to carry quietly. And he definitely did not know she cried herself to sleep last night replaying his voice saying she was replaceable. The office doors suddenly opened behind her. Adrian walked in without looking up from his phone, his dark overcoat still damp from the rain outside. "Move the Chicago call to 11, he said immediately. "The board presentation was revised overnight." Claire handed him the updated folders without a word. Adrian finally glanced toward her, briefly noticing the exhaustion beneath her eyes. "You look tired." The concern sounded automatic. Professional. Like checking the weather. Claire nodded once. "Long night." Adrian loosened his tie while scanning emails. "Did Lucas drive you home after the gala?" The question came too casually. Too quickly. Claire blinked in surprise. "Yes." "It was raining." Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "You seem comfortable with him already." Claire looked at him carefully then, noticing the sharpness hidden beneath his calm tone. "Lucas was being kind." Adrian set his phone down harder than necessary. "People in this company should focus less on being kind and more on doing their jobs." Silence settled heavily between them. Claire lowered her eyes slowly. "Understood, Mr. Whitmore." Something about the formality in her voice irritated him instantly. Adrian rubbed a hand across his jaw, suddenly restless for reasons he could not explain. Across the desk, Claire quietly gathered additional files for the morning meeting, but for the first time since joining Whitmore Dynamics, she no longer moved around Adrian like someone emotionally tethered to him. There was distance now. Cold distance. And somehow that frightened him far more than anger ever could. 3 days later, Adrian Whitmore realized something terrifying about his life. He could manage billion-dollar negotiations without blinking. He could survive market crashes, lawsuits, hostile investors, and public scandals. But he could not function properly in an office that no longer carried Claire Bennett's quiet presence. Rain hammered against the giant windows of Whitmore Dynamics while Manhattan disappeared beneath gray clouds and flashing brake lights below. Inside the executive floor, tension clung to the air like smoke. Adrian stood near the conference table rubbing his temple as another meeting dissolved into confusion. "These numbers were supposed to be finalized yesterday," he snapped. The finance director shifted nervously. "Claire usually organized the revisions before approval." The room fell silent immediately after her name. Adrian's jaw tightened. Claire had requested temporary remote work 48 hours earlier, citing family matters and exhaustion. He approved it in less than 30 seconds, pretending the decision meant nothing. But now her absence echoed through every inch of the building. Schedules overlapped. Investor calls were misplaced. Half the executive staff suddenly looked lost without realizing how much Claire had quietly managed behind the scenes for years. Adrian dismissed the meeting abruptly and returned to his office, irritation pulsing beneath his skin. The black coffee waiting on his desk had gone cold because nobody remembered he refused sugar. His afternoon medication was missing entirely. Even the lighting in the office felt wrong somehow. Too bright. Too empty. He sat heavily behind his desk, opening email after email without absorbing any of the words. Then his eyes landed on the pale yellow sticky note near the keyboard. "Take care of yourself, Mr. Whitmore." Adrian stared at the handwriting longer than he should have. For years, those tiny notes had blended into the background of his life. Reminders to eat, to sleep, to call his doctor. Small invisible acts of care he never acknowledged because admitting their importance felt dangerously close to needing someone. His phone buzzed suddenly. Lucas Hale. Adrian answered immediately, his voice colder than intended. "What?" Lucas sounded calm. "Claire forwarded me the revised legal contracts before logging off. I thought you would want them before tomorrow." Adrian leaned back slowly. "You seem very involved with Claire lately." A brief pause followed. "She is going through a difficult time," Lucas answered carefully. "Someone should probably notice that." Adrian's expression darkened instantly. "I pay her extremely well to do her job. That is not what I meant." Adrian ended the call before Lucas could finish. Silence crashed back into the office. Outside the glass walls, thunder rolled across Manhattan while rain streaked down the windows in silver lines. Adrian suddenly remembered the gala balcony. Claire standing alone in the cold. Lucas placing his coat around her shoulders. The memory burned under his skin in a way he hated. He stood abruptly and walked toward the private staff hallway without fully realizing why. The executive assistant area remained mostly empty this late in the evening, computer screens glowing softly beneath dim overhead lights. Claire's desk sat perfectly organized near the corner window. Adrian stopped there quietly. Her chair pushed in neatly. Her coffee mug gone. The faint scent of vanilla and paper still lingering somehow in the silence she left behind. Then he noticed another sticky note attached to her monitor. The handwriting made his chest tighten instantly. Investor call moved to Thursday. Please do not skip dinner again. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. Nobody else in the company spoke to him that way. Nobody else dared to care whether he ate dinner at all. And suddenly the realization became impossible to ignore. Claire Bennett had never been replaceable. She had become the emotional center of a life Adrian Whitmore did not know how to live without. Jealousy does not arrive like love. Love is quiet. Jealousy is humiliating. It drags every ugly insecurity into the light and forces a person to look at it. Adrian Whitmore had spent most of his adult life mastering control. Investors trusted him because he never lost composure. Employees feared him because he never showed emotion. The financial world practically worshipped the cold precision that turned Whitmore Dynamics into one of the most powerful technology companies in America. But over the next 2 weeks, that control began cracking in ways Adrian could no longer hide. It started during a Monday board meeting on the 42nd floor. Rain hammered softly against the windows while executives reviewed expansion projections for Seattle and Dallas. Adrian sat at the head of the polished black conference table pretending to focus on quarterly numbers, but his attention kept drifting toward the empty chair near the wall where Claire usually sat organizing reports. Then the elevator doors opened. Claire stepped into the room carrying updated contracts against her chest, her cream-colored coat still dusted with snow from outside. Every conversation in Adrian's head stopped instantly. She looked exhausted. Softer somehow. Her blonde hair tied back loosely, dark circles faint beneath her eyes, but she still moved with that same quiet grace that always unsettled him more than confidence ever could. "Sorry I am late," she said calmly. "Traffic near Midtown was backed up for almost an hour." Adrian noticed Lucas Hale standing immediately behind her holding 2 coffee cups. "I grabbed your favorite," Lucas said softly while handing one toward Claire. She smiled at him. Not professionally. Not politely. A real smile. Adrian's stomach tightened so suddenly it almost hurt. The meeting resumed, but Adrian barely heard any of it. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the opposite side of the room where Lucas leaned closer to Claire during discussions, occasionally making her laugh quietly under her breath. Adrian hated the sound instantly. By the end of the meeting, one investor made the mistake of asking a routine question twice. Adrian's patience snapped. "If you cannot follow basic projections, perhaps someone else should handle your portfolio," he said coldly. The room froze. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Claire looked up immediately, surprise flashing across her face because Adrian almost never lost control publicly. He stood abruptly. "Meeting over." The second the conference room emptied, Claire followed him into his office. "What was that?" she asked carefully after the doors shut. Adrian loosened his tie aggressively. "What was what?" "You embarrassed half the board." "Maybe half the board should stop wasting my time." Claire crossed her arms slowly. "You have been angry at everyone for days." Adrian looked directly at her then. "And you seem very comfortable spending time with Lucas Hale lately." Silence filled the office instantly. Claire blinked once, genuinely stunned. "That is what this is about." Adrian looked away first. "I do not care who you spend time with." The lie sounded hollow even to him. Claire studied him quietly for several seconds before shaking her head. "You do not get to treat me like I mean nothing and then suddenly care who buys me coffee." Adrian's chest tightened painfully. "Claire, no." Her voice remained calm, but the sadness inside it cut deeper than anger could have. "You made your position very clear at the gala." She turned toward the door, then stopped briefly without facing him again. "The worst part is, I believed you." The office door closed softly behind her. Adrian stood completely still in the silence afterward, staring at the empty space she left behind while something unfamiliar settled heavily inside his chest. Fear. Because for the first time since meeting Claire Bennett, Adrian Whitmore realized another man might become the safe place she once tried to be for him. Sometimes the person carrying the heaviest burden is the one still smiling while asking everyone else if they are okay. Snow fell quietly across Queens that Friday night, covering parked cars and narrow sidewalks in soft white layers while Christmas lights flickered weakly from apartment windows along the block. Claire Bennett climbed the cracked front steps of her mother's building carrying 2 grocery bags against her chest, exhaustion weighing down every movement. The elevator had been broken for 3 months, so she walked all 6 flights slowly, pausing twice because her arms ached from carrying groceries, medications, and another stack of unpaid medical bills hidden beneath the food. Inside apartment 6B, warmth and the smell of chicken soup wrapped around her instantly. "Honey, you are home," her mother called weakly from the tiny kitchen. Claire forced brightness into her voice. "And I brought your favorite bread from the bakery downstairs." Eleanor Bennett smiled tiredly from her wheelchair near the stove, one blanket wrapped around her thin shoulders. The stroke last year had taken most of her mobility, but not her gentleness. Claire immediately knelt beside her mother to help adjust the blanket higher. "You should not be cooking. You should not be working yourself to death either," Eleanor replied softly. Claire laughed quietly, but the sound lacked real energy. While unpacking groceries onto the counter, another envelope slipped from her purse accidentally and landed near the sink. "Final notice" stamped across the hospital bill in red letters. Eleanor noticed immediately. "Claire, it is fine." Claire interrupted too quickly. "I already spoke to billing." Another lie. The truth was much worse. The surgery her mother now needed would cost more money than Claire had saved in nearly 4 years working beside Adrian Whitmore. She had already sold her car 2 weeks ago to keep up with medications and physical therapy sessions. Most nights she survived on coffee and granola bars because every extra dollar went toward hospital payments. Yet somehow, every morning at Whitmore Dynamics, She still smiled politely and asked Adrian whether he had eaten lunch. Her phone buzzed softly against the kitchen counter. Lucas Hale. Hope your mom is feeling better tonight. Claire stared at the message for a second before typing back a simple thank you. Across Manhattan, Adrian Whitmore sat alone inside his penthouse office high above the city skyline, unable to focus on anything in front of him. The rain earlier had turned into snow, white flakes drifting slowly past the giant windows while untouched food sat cold on the dining table behind him. His laptop remained open to financial projections, but his attention stayed trapped elsewhere. Claire's face inside his office earlier that week. The sadness in her voice when she said he made his position clear. Adrian rubbed his eyes tiredly before opening the employee scheduling system on instinct. Claire Bennett. Temporary remote status extended another 14 days. Attached documentation approved by Human Resources. Adrian frowned slightly. Attached medical support request. He clicked before thinking twice. The screen loaded slowly. Then his entire body went still. Physical rehabilitation records. Neurology appointments. Cardiac surgery estimates. Patient name, Eleanor Bennett. Adrian stared silently at the numbers listed beneath projected surgery costs. His chest tightened painfully as realization settled over him piece by piece. Claire had not pulled away because she was manipulative. She was drowning. Working impossible hours while taking care of a sick mother completely alone. Selling pieces of her own life quietly while still remembering his medication every morning. Adrian leaned back heavily in the chair, shame spreading slowly through him. He remembered every moment he accused her of distraction. Every jealous remark. Every cold response. And suddenly the memory of her standing on that freezing balcony after the gala became unbearable. Because while Adrian Whitmore spent weeks obsessing over another man buying Claire coffee, Claire Bennett had been trying to hold her entire world together without asking anyone to save her. Adrian Whitmore had spent his entire life believing weakness was dangerous. Feelings complicated judgment. Attachment created vulnerability. And vulnerability destroyed people. That belief built his empire. But somewhere between the late nights, the empty penthouse dinners, and the woman who quietly reminded him to take his medication every morning, Adrian had made one catastrophic mistake. He let himself need someone without ever admitting it out loud. The snowstorm outside Manhattan intensified after midnight, thick white flakes swallowing the city beneath silence while Adrian sat alone inside his dark penthouse living room with a glass of untouched whiskey resting in his hand. The fireplace crackled softly nearby, shadows moving across the expensive marble walls, but none of the luxury around him felt warm anymore. For the first time in years, Adrian had cancelled every meeting for the next morning. His board blamed exhaustion. Investors blamed stress. But the truth sat much deeper than business. He could not stop thinking about Claire Bennett. He leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on his knees, then opened the bottom drawer of the coffee table beside him. Inside sat a small stack of old company phones and backup devices collected over the years. Adrian stared at them for several seconds before finally pulling one free and powering it on. The screen glowed softly in the darkness. Archived voicemails. Hundreds of them. Most from executives. Lawyers. Investors. Then his thumb stopped moving. Claire Bennett. Adrian pressed play before he could change his mind. Good morning, Mr. Whitmore. Your 8 o'clock flight was moved to Terminal 4 because of weather. And please remember your medication is still in the top drawer because you forgot it again. Her voice filled the silent room gently. Calm. Familiar. Another message. You skipped lunch today, so I sent soup upstairs. Please do not survive on coffee for the 3rd day in a row. Another. Happy birthday, Adrian. I know you hate celebrating, but there is cheesecake in the conference fridge if you decide being human for 5 minutes sounds tolerable. Adrian closed his eyes immediately. The sound of her laughing softly at the end of the message hit him harder than he expected. Because suddenly every voicemail became proof of something he spent years pretending not to see. Claire had cared for him in hundreds of tiny invisible ways while asking almost nothing in return. And he repaid that loyalty by humiliating her publicly because seeing another man near her terrified him more than losing billion-dollar contracts ever had. Adrian stood abruptly and walked toward the giant windows overlooking Central Park. Snow covered the streets below in pale silver, while headlights moved slowly through the storm. Somewhere across the city, Claire was probably sitting beside her mother worrying about hospital bills while believing she meant nothing to him. The thought made his chest ache sharply. His phone buzzed suddenly behind him. Lucas Hale. Adrian almost ignored it before answering. What? Lucas sighed quietly on the other end. Claire left work early again today. She almost collapsed in the lobby. Adrian froze instantly. What happened? Exhaustion, Lucas answered carefully. She is trying to handle too much alone. Silence stretched heavily between them. Then Lucas spoke again, softer this time. You know, for someone who claims she is replaceable, you look like you are falling apart without her. The call ended a few seconds later, but Adrian remained standing motionless beside the glass windows long afterward. Falling apart. The words echoed painfully because they were true. He had not slept properly in weeks. He snapped at employees for no reason. He checked Claire's calendar obsessively. He noticed every missing detail she used to handle before he even realized they mattered. Adrian pressed a hand against his chest slowly, breathing uneven for the first time in years. The terrifying part was not jealousy anymore. The terrifying part was finally understanding that Claire Bennett had become the closest thing to home he had left in the world. Love becomes real the moment someone chooses to protect your dignity even when nobody would know the difference. Monday morning arrived beneath pale winter sunlight spilling across Manhattan rooftops while Claire Bennett sat in the crowded cardiology waiting room beside her mother, trying not to look at the growing stack of paperwork trembling slightly in her hands. Around them, televisions played soft daytime news while exhausted families whispered beside vending machines and paper coffee cups. Eleanor Bennett rested quietly against the wheelchair, her breathing shallow but calm. Claire kept forcing reassuring smiles every time her mother glanced toward her. Everything will work out, she whispered gently while adjusting the blanket over Eleanor's knees. But inside, panic kept tightening harder with every passing minute. The surgery deposit deadline was today. Without payment confirmation by 5 o'clock, the hospital would postpone the procedure another 3 months. 3 months Eleanor probably did not have. Claire lowered her eyes toward the numbers again, trying to calculate impossible solutions one more time. Maybe another loan. Maybe selling more furniture. Maybe taking a second remote job overnight. Miss Bennett? Claire looked up quickly as a nurse approached holding a clipboard. The billing department needs to see you before pre-op scheduling. Her stomach dropped instantly. Claire nodded slowly before wheeling her mother toward the elevator down the long white hallway smelling faintly of antiseptic and coffee. She already knew the conversation waiting downstairs. Another apology. Another delay. Another impossible number she could not pay. But the moment Claire stepped into the billing office, the woman behind the desk smiled warmly instead of sympathetically. Miss Bennett, everything has been approved. Claire blinked in confusion. Approved? Yes. The woman turned her monitor slightly. Your mother's surgery, rehabilitation program, medication support, and post-operative care have all been fully covered through the Whitmore Foundation Medical Assistance Initiative. Claire stared at her silently. There has to be some mistake. No mistake. The woman handed over several documents. The authorization was finalized this morning. Claire looked down at the paperwork, pulse pounding harder with every page. Anonymous donor request. Full confidentiality. Her breath caught slowly. Because there was only one person powerful enough to solve something this quickly. Across the city, Adrian Whitmore stood near the windows of his office watching snow melt across the streets below, while his phone rested silent in his hand. He had spent the entire weekend making calls through the Whitmore Foundation board, quietly restructuring emergency medical grants so Claire would never suspect the help came directly from him. No press releases. No recognition. No conditions attached. For the first time in his life, Adrian did something important without expecting control in return. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Lucas Hale stepped inside holding a legal folder beneath one arm. The hospital confirmed everything went through. Adrian nodded once. Good. Lucas studied him carefully for a second. You could have told her yourself. Adrian looked back toward the snowy skyline. If she thinks I did it to make her stay, she will hate me even more. Silence settled between them before Lucas spoke again. You really love her. Adrian let out a quiet breath that almost sounded tired. I think I have for a long time. Later that evening, Claire sat alone beside her mother's hospital bed while snow drifted softly outside the darkened windows. Eleanor slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, the surgery officially scheduled for Wednesday morning. Claire should have felt relieved. Instead, confusion kept pulling at her chest. She looked down again at the authorization papers resting beside her coat. Whitmore Foundation. Anonymous donor request. Then another memory surfaced suddenly. Adrian quietly covering employees' medical expenses after Hurricane Sandy years earlier without telling anyone. Adrian anonymously funding scholarships for staff children. Adrian pretending not to care while always noticing everything painful around him. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Somewhere deep down, she already knew the truth. But the possibility frightened her almost as much as losing him once already had. The hardest apologies are the ones spoken after someone already stopped expecting you to care. 2 days later, freezing rain swept across Manhattan again, turning sidewalks slick beneath glowing streetlights while Claire Bennett sat alone in the hospital cafeteria staring at a cup of untouched tea gone cold between her hands. Her mother's surgery had lasted almost 6 hours. Every second inside that waiting room felt endless. But now, finally, Eleanor Bennett was stable and resting upstairs in recovery. Relief should have made Claire feel lighter. Instead, confusion still lingered heavily in her chest because the anonymous donor explanation no longer made sense. Not after what she overheard an hour earlier. Claire had been walking back from the pharmacy when 2 Whitmore Foundation board members stepped off the elevator nearby discussing emergency grant approvals. Whitmore personally pushed the Bennett case through overnight, one man said quietly. I have never seen him override legal that fast. Claire stopped walking instantly. The second man shook his head with disbelief. For a CEO who claims he does not care about employees, he sure looked terrified. Claire never made it to the elevator after that. Now she sat frozen in the nearly empty cafeteria replaying the words again and again while rain streaked against the giant hospital windows behind her. Terrified. Adrian Whitmore. The same man who publicly called her replaceable. The same man who quietly saved her mother without asking for credit. Nothing about him made sense anymore. Claire. Her breath caught softly at the sound of his voice. Adrian stood near the cafeteria entrance wearing a dark wool coat still damp from the rain outside, exhaustion visible beneath his sharp features for the first time since she had known him. No security team. No assistants. Just him. Claire looked away first. You should not be here. Adrian stepped closer slowly. How is your mother? Recovering. Her voice stayed careful. Controlled. Thanks to you? Silence stretched between them. Adrian glanced briefly toward the rain-covered windows before speaking quietly. I did not do it so you would owe me anything. Claire laughed softly, but sadness edged the sound. That is what makes this harder. Adrian's chest tightened. He moved closer to the table but remained standing. Claire! She finally looked up at him then, eyes tired from weeks of crying and sleepless nights. Why? Adrian frowned slightly. Why what? Why humiliate me in front of half of Manhattan and then turn around and save my family? The question landed between them painfully. Adrian lowered his eyes for a second before answering honestly for once in his life. Because I was afraid. Claire stared at him in disbelief. Afraid of what? Adrian let out a slow breath, shoulders heavy beneath the dim cafeteria lighting. You. The word almost sounded broken coming from him. Every time someone got close to me in the past, they wanted something. Money. Access. Control. His jaw tightened slightly. But you never asked for anything except whether I remembered to eat lunch. Claire felt tears burn suddenly behind her eyes. Adrian continued quietly. And when I saw Lucas with you, I realized how much power you had to hurt me without even trying. So you hurt me first, Claire whispered. Adrian closed his eyes briefly because she was right. Completely right. The silence afterward felt fragile. Rain tapped softly against the windows while distant hospital announcements echoed faintly through the hallway outside. Then Adrian finally looked directly at her again, all the arrogance gone from his expression. I loved you long before I understood how to say it without destroying it. Claire's breath caught instantly. Adrian stepped closer slowly, voice lower now. And by the time I realized what you meant to me, I had already convinced you that you meant nothing to me. Neither of them moved after that. Because for the first time since they met, Adrian Whitmore stood in front of Claire Bennett with nothing left to hide behind except the truth. 1 year later, the first thing people noticed about Adrian Whitmore was no longer his wealth. It was the way he looked at Claire Bennett, like losing her once had permanently changed him. Manhattan glittered beneath a clear December sky while cameras flashed across the grand ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Winter Gala, now transformed into one of the largest charity events in New York City. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of guests dressed in black tie while soft piano music drifted through the room. But tonight was different from every gala before it. The giant screen near the stage displayed a single phrase in elegant silver letters. The Bennett Care Initiative. A nationwide employee assistance program providing financial support for workers caring for sick family members. Free rehabilitation aid. Emergency medical grants. Paid caregiver leave. Thousands of families already helped within the first year alone. Near the ballroom entrance, Claire stood quietly beside her mother watching guests arrive while emotion tightened softly in her chest. Eleanor Bennett looked healthier now, warmth returned to her cheeks after months of recovery and physical therapy. He built all of this because of you, Eleanor whispered gently. Claire shook her head. He built it because he finally let himself care openly. Across the ballroom, Adrian finished speaking with several board members before his eyes found Claire instantly, like they always did now. The room still respected him. Feared him even. But somewhere over the last year, the coldness that once surrounded Adrian Whitmore had disappeared. Employees no longer whispered nervously when he walked through headquarters. He remembered birthdays now. Asked whether people were sleeping enough. Forced executives to take family leave after medical emergencies. And every morning, without fail, he still found a pale yellow sticky note waiting somewhere on his desk from Claire. Eat breakfast today. Do not survive on caffeine and ego. Adrian smiled softly just thinking about it. Lucas Hale appeared beside him holding a champagne glass. You realize half of Wall Street thinks you lost your mind this year. Adrian adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo calmly. Maybe I finally found it. Lucas laughed quietly before glancing toward Claire. You are going to tell her tonight? Adrian followed his gaze across the ballroom. Claire stood beneath golden lights wearing a dark emerald dress, her smile softer now than it used to be during the years she carried everything alone. Beautiful. Familiar. Home. Adrian nodded once. I should have said it a long time ago. Minutes later, the ballroom lights dimmed softly as Adrian stepped onto the stage. Hundreds of conversations faded into silence immediately. Adrian rarely spoke publicly unless absolutely necessary. He adjusted the microphone slowly before looking directly toward Claire in the crowd. A year ago, he began quietly, I believed strength meant never needing anyone. The room remained completely silent. Then someone spent 4 years quietly taking care of me while I convinced myself attachment was weakness. Claire's breath caught instantly. Adrian stepped down from the stage slowly, never taking his eyes off her while cameras flashed around them. This initiative exists because one woman taught me that kindness is not small. His voice lowered gently. It saves people. By now the entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as Adrian stopped directly in front of Claire. Then, without hesitation, one of the most powerful men in America lowered himself onto one knee. Gasps spread softly through the crowd. Adrian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out something far smaller than diamonds or wealth. A faded pale yellow sticky note carefully preserved inside glass. The very first one Claire ever left on his desk. "Remember to eat lunch today." Claire covered her mouth instantly as tears filled her eyes. Adrian looked up at her with the same vulnerability he once spent his entire life hiding. "You spent years making sure I survived," he said softly. "Now I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never carry the world alone again." The ballroom disappeared around Claire in that moment. The cameras, the lights, the billionaires. None of it mattered. Because the man kneeling in front of her was no longer the cold CEO who once called her replaceable. He was simply Adrian. The man who finally learned that love was never the thing destroying him. Fear was.